on our good old friends for many, many years, founder members of our community in London. And we've kept in touch, Baruch Hashem. We've come on Aliyah. We lived in the same street. We came on Aliyah in the same year. And we're, Baruch Hashem, in touch with each other a fair amount. Truly wonderful, wonderful friends. I also would like to mention, as you just now mentioned, the Diane Ehrentreu, who is Diane Chanach Ehrentreu, who was the Rosh Bezdin of London for many, many years, and continued to be the posek of London and of the UK, and further than that as well. Diane Ehrentreu has always been for me a most wonderful good friend and a Rov, and many people are not aware that even though it's true that everybody needs a Rov, needs to have a rabbi who they can go to, it's even more important for a rabbi to have a rabbi that he can go to. You need to have a rabbi's rabbi. You know, all rabbonim need to have someone to consult when issues come up which they're not certain about, and they need consultation. And Diane Ehrentreu was for me for the full 35 years that I was the Rav of Ner Yisrael. Diane Ehrentreu was always my go-to consultant on all matters, all rabbinic and communal matters. And I'm sorry to hear that he's unwell. He's had a stroke, but please God, he'll get his strength back. But we all daven for him. His Shem Kodesh is Chanoich ben Blimala. And we're all saying Tehillim for him, and please God, he should make a speedy recovery, b'karov. Diane Ehrentreu also is not just the Av Bezdin in England, but he was also the halachic authority pretty much for most of Europe. I often was in his house. There was hardly a week I wasn't in his house discussing various things with him. And in that sense, I'm really a Talmud of his. And very often he had on his desk questions from the Bezdin in France and in Germany and in Italy and in the USSR at the time, and he was answering shilas from all over Europe whenever the Bezdin of these countries had something which was too difficult for them and they needed to consult. Diane Ehrentreu was always their reference point. So we need him, but I'm sorry to hear that he's unwell, and please God, he should make a refuah shalem. Okay. We're going to start. The topic of this course of shiurim is called Themes in Sefer Bereishit. And Sefer Bereishit is really got so much of the most profound and fascinating ideas of emunah, of Jewish thought, of Jewish history, and of understanding Torah. And I'd like to go through, if you have prepared a text, bringing in some of the meforshim, some of the classic commentaries on the Torah, and we're going to be looking at some of my favorite selections from these commentaries. So just by way of introduction, obviously when we start off Bereishis, last Shabbos we laned Parshas Bereishis, we need to have a bit of a closer look at the creation. The creation itself is something of major proportions and a fundamental principle, not just of our understanding the Torah, but of emunah in general. People sometimes make a mistake and don't really fully appreciate the significance of the idea of the creation. When we speak about the fact that the belief that we have, which comes from the Torah, the Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz, we're making not just a factual statement about God as the creator, it's much, much more than that. Right? By saying that we understand and we believe that the world was created by God, we're actually making a much deeper statement, which we will look at in today's share a little bit more, which is we believe that the world was created for a purpose. It wasn't created by chance. And in fact, if you had to ask me what is one of the most profound differences of opinion that exist between the secular, scientific, atheistic world which surrounds us, as opposed to the Torah beliefs, it's not the question about how the world came into existence, but it's the question of whether the world came into existence for a purpose or not. the main machlokas, the main dispute that we have with secular science is the idea that secular science insists on saying regularly that the creation of the world was a random event. It came into being without any particular intention, without any particular goal in mind, and just by chance, the subatomic particles combine to form atoms, the atoms combine to form molecules, the molecules combine to form planets and life form, and the life forms emerged, and it was all random. It was a random process without any guiding intelligence, without any goal in mind. And therefore the world itself just happened to be the way it is. And isn't that amazing? That is the myth, if you like, of the scientific world, which opposes any claim, if you like, that the world was brought into existence for a purpose and by design. And of course, once you accept the idea that the world has a purpose, the next question is, what is that purpose, and what role can I play in bringing that purpose closer to its fruition? And that's the whole Torah. So in actual fact, the whole Torah, in a sense, is a commentary on Bereishit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. Once we accept the fundamental principle that God created the world and he had in mind a certain goal, then the rest of the Torah is describing to us what that goal is. The goal of the Torah is that there should be some human beings who live a particular sort of life, a life of emunah, a life of chesed, a life of yirat shamayim. That was the goal. If you accept the idea of the secular atheistic science, that the world came into being as a random event without any goal in mind at all, then we just happen to be here by chance, and there's hardly any basis for any morality or codes of practice other than practical considerations. Incidentally, we said before, we expressed our good wishes to Diane Ehrentreu for his recovery. I'd also like to express our good wishes for Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who is also unwell and who needs our refuah shalema. Rabbi Sachs is a good friend and colleague of mine, and which we spent many hours together. We had certain amount in common, actually. In our earlier years, he was studying philosophy in Cambridge, and I was studying philosophy in London University at UCL. And there weren't many rabbis around studying philosophy professionally, and not many rabbis around who did PhDs in philosophy. So we had a certain common ground between us, and we used to discuss certain things together. But then, of course, he became a world class and a world renowned, and his writings are absolutely brilliant, and his always worth reading and always worth listening to. And we wish him a refuah shalema. Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba should have a refuah shalema. He's undergoing treatment for a major medical condition. But I'd like to mention, in the context of this shir, for those of you who haven't read his books, you should read them, although some of them are not so easy to read. I remember he once said that he went to visit his mother, Zechron Livracha, and she said to him, "Jonathan, when are you going to write a book that I can read, that I can understand?" That was her greeting to him. That's what he quoted. But there is one book which I do recommend to everybody, which is called The Great Partnership. And this book has a direct bearing on learning Parshas Bereishit. The Great Partnership is a really extraordinary, well-written book. And what is the partnership that he's referring to? Is the partnership between Torah and science. And he's written a book, and the essential claim, the thesis of the book is that there can never be a contradiction between Torah and science, because Torah and science are actually answering completely different questions. Science is answering the question about how the world works, what are the systems and the rules of nature, and the mechanisms by which biology and physics and chemistry and gravity, how it works. But Torah answers the question about why the world works, why it's there, what is the purpose. And that brings me back to the point I made earlier, that the goal of the Torah is not to give us scientific knowledge. And when the Torah makes a seemingly scientific statement, it isn't making a scientific statement at all. It's making a statement about purpose and meaning. And therefore, says Rabbi Sachs in that book, you couldn't ever have a contradiction between science and Torah any more than you could ever have a contradiction between mathematics and poetry. There's simply different forms of knowledge, different forms of literature addressing completely different areas of human concern. But the way the book is written and the way it's built up is definitely worth reading. I don't, unfortunately, get a commission, so I'm not getting a commission on the sale of this book, I'd like you to know. But nevertheless, I do recommend it to everybody. And if you have a friend or a child or a grandchild studying science in any context at all, this is a wonderful present to give them. The Great Partnership by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, a masterpiece of a book, deals with very profound issues of emunah, of how to learn the Torah, of science and human understanding. One of the points that he makes, which is not an unknown point, which he deals with early on in the book, is something which modern science only in the last 50 years really understands a little bit better, is the idea of the difference between the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain. So the left-hand side of the brain deals with matters of mathematics and analysis and concepts and text and systematic thinking, which is more scientific. And the right-hand side of the brain deals with matters which are more spiritual and more deals with morality, with relationships, doesn't deal with mathematics, but deals with music and with poetry, and is a different faculty that the human being has got. So his thesis is that Torah and science, in a sense, I mean, it's not completely true, but in a sense, appeal to the two different parts of the human brain. Science is left-hand side of the brain, and Torah requires a person to engage in spiritual and moral understanding, which is the right-hand side of the brain. And the way the two interact is the secret of Jewish wisdom, and more about that maybe at a later date. Anyhow, Al Kol Panim, I'd like to just I'd like to look at two things today. Particularly, I'm interested in some of the writings of the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, who was writing in the 1200s, and undoubtedly one of the most significant Rishonim commentaries on the Chumash, one of the great leaders of Spain in the 13th century, and he made Aliyah to Israel at a certain point in the middle of the 13th century, and came in the end of his life. He spent the last few years of his life in Israel. Sadly, we don't know where he died or when he died exactly, and there is no kever that is known of the Ramban. He must have just been somehow lost in the world of Israel at that time, which was a dangerous and difficult place to live, with lots of fighting factions and lots of pandemics and poverty, and not an easy place to survive. Okay, let's have a look. Let's start off. A good place to start is Bereishit chapter 1, Pasuk 1, Bereishit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. I'm going to share a text on the screen, and we're going to have a look at the Pasuk. And the question I'd like to look at is, what was really created in the beginning? Right? Bereishit means in the beginning. But what was really created in the beginning? Because if we then look at the whole of chapter 1 of Bereishit, it tells us day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and then day 7. But on day 1, according to the account of Bereishit chapter 1, all that was created was Vayhi Or. There was light. So what does it mean? Bereishit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. When did he create heaven and earth? Was that day 1, day 2? And why is that important? So I'd like to show you a very beautiful and very thought-provoking statement of some of the Rishonim here. See if I can find this. There we go. Can you see a text? Ellie, can you give me a thumbs up? Yes, you can see a text? Excellent. Every time the share the screen works, for me, this is a nace. You understand? Every time Zoom works, I'm afraid I still belong to the generation where the whole of Zoom is something of a miracle. And it's an act of emunah, even just to sign in and start giving this share. But seeing all your faces here on the screen certainly encourages me. So let's have a look at this. Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz, arguably one of the most famous psukim of the whole Chumash, right? In the beginning, God creates heaven and earth, right? So what is it really that is being created? Here? So what's interesting here is a couple of things. First of all, the word bara. The word bara has got a particular significance as opposed to other synonyms that's got later on. For example, it says vaya'as Hashem Elokim, that God made certain things, right? Or vayitzer. So there are different verbs here meaning to create. Yitzira, Yud Tzadi Reish is one verb. Vaya'as la'asot is another one, right? And there are different types of verbs used, but the word bara, Beis Reish Aleph, has got a very specific meaning, as we'll see in a minute in the Ramban. And what does it mean, Es HaShamayim v'Es HaAretz? Let me just give you very brief, probably the most seemingly insignificant word in the whole pasuk is the word es, right? Why does it say es? The word es is a very strange word in the Torah, right? The pasuk could easily have been written, Bereishis bara Elokim shamayim v'aretz. That pasuk would have been perfectly coherent and grammatically correct. Bereishis bara Elokim shamayim v'aretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. What is being added by the word es? So I just want to tell you as a footnote here, that's not going to be my major theme here, but in the Kabbalistic world, in the world of the Mekubalim, right? I'll just stop the share for a minute. In the world of the Mekubalim, the way creation is described is really based on the Hebrew alphabet. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu used the Hebrew alphabet to create the world. This sounds to us like a strange idea, but the idea is probably the oldest book in the Kabbalistic library is a book called the Sefer HaYetzirah, the book of creation. No one's sure exactly who wrote it, but it certainly predates the Zohar and predates all other, as far as I'm aware of. And the Sefer HaYetzirah speaks about the power of each letter in the Hebrew alphabet to create certain items. And in actual fact, the Gemara in Brachos, which is speaking about the building of the Mishkan, which I think I mentioned this in a previous share at some point. The Gemara in Brachos says, I think Daf Nun Hey involved somewhere around there. The Gemara says that what was special about Betzalel? Betzalel was the chief architect of the Mishkan. But the pasuk says about Betzalel, "Va'amale oso ruach Elokim b'chochma bina u'v'das." It says about him that he wasn't just a competent craftsman, right? He was actually he was full of ruach Elokim with chochma bina and das. What could that possibly refer to? So the Gemara says the following line: Yodea hoyo Betzalel. Betzalel knew letzaref ha'osios shebahem nivru shamayim va'aretz. He knew how to combine the letters in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu used to create heaven and earth. That somehow the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, when used in a certain way, have creative powers. Now, in order to understand that, you have to get into the more Kabbalistic world, which I'm not. But I'm just telling you that that's what is mentioned here. And that is I think I might have mentioned to you also before that actually the English word that we're familiar with, which is abracadabra. Who hasn't heard of the phrase abracadabra? Abracadabra is actually Hebrew. And abracadabra means abra, means I will create, kadabra, by speaking. Abracadabra was the magician's magician's opening line, I will now do a magic trick, abracadabra. I will create something amazing by saying certain words. The power of the word to create new things in the universe. This was, so magicians call it magic, but the Torah calls it Bereishit bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses statements, Vayomer Elokim v'hi'or. God uses words to bring the world into existence. And now if you have another look back in the Pasuk again, so I said to you that the word es seems to be unnecessary in this Pasuk, right? The Pasuk could have read perfectly meaningfully without the word es hashamayim and es haaretz. It could have just said shamayim v'aretz. So the Mukubalim say that es means from aleph till taf. The word es is from the first to the last letter of the alphabet. So the Mukubalim say Bereishit bara Elokim es, comma, means at the beginning God created the alphabet. He created the Hebrew alphabet, aleph till taf, right? And then once he had that, those were the tools with which he created the universe. So that is really a more mystical, Kabbalistic, which I'm sure I have not done justice to this idea, but you need to ask your local Kabbalist to explain it to you a little bit better. But that is definitely a central idea in the whole of creation from the point of view of the more mystical understanding of the Torah. Let's have a look at the Ramban for a moment. So he says rather dramatically, "Va'ato shema pirush hamikra al pashuto nochrein uboro." Listen carefully, he says, I'm going to tell you clearly and explicitly what is pashuto shel mikra. So he says, it goes like this. What is the simple meaning? He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu bara kol hanivroim me'afisa muchletes. The Hebrew of the Ramban is also very beautiful. I mean, he's got a Hebrew which is very clear and very powerful. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created all the universe me'afisa muchletes. This word afisa comes from the word ephes, meaning zero, right? Right? Zero, and muchletet means absolute zero. In other words, before the moment of Bereishit bara Elokim, there was nothing in this world, nothing existed yet, except for God himself, right? God, of course, pre-existed the universe, as we say every day, Adon Olam, Hashem Olach, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. God who existed before any Yitzir Nivra, before anything was created, right? And after the world ceases to exist, right? He will continue to exist. In other words, God's existence is not dependent on the existence of the universe. It existed before it and will exist after it. But the world itself was brought into existence me'afisa muchletet, from absolute nothingness. I'd just like to stop on that for 1 second. And if you read some of the writings of modern science in this question of the origins of the universe, if you're a bit bored later today, you can get online and tap in to Google origins of the universe. And there is a massive library in the scientific world dealing with what they call cosmology, which is the various different theories about how the world came to exist. Now, from the beginning of Western intellectual life, which is basically Aristotle and Plato, until 1950, which is not such a long time ago, the scientific world believed firmly, as an axiomatic principle of science, that the physical world was never created and that it had always existed. That matter was eternal. It's important to remember that, to give that some thought. Aristotle and Plato both believed there was a physical world and a spiritual world, and that the physical world existed eternally, had always existed, right? And it was only in the 1950s that certain experiments were made which proved conclusively that the world had a beginning, that there was a beginning, right? And they called that the Big Bang, because they had no other really intelligent, it's not a particularly intelligent piece of terminology, the Big Bang. The Big Bang means there was some mega explosion. Why it took place, they can't explain. Who made it take place? Clearly nobody. It was a random event. And in that Big Bang, something came into existence, as the Ramban writes, me'afisa muchletes, from total nothing. How does something come about from nothing? That is a violation of all the rules of science. Nothing comes into existence from nothing. It's impossible. You always got to have in science, you always have to have a cause and an effect. The cause has to precede the effect, and you can't create something out of total zero. If you have absolutely nothing, you can't create anything out of that. You have to start with something, and then you can change it, right? You can change different atoms into different atoms, but you can't start with nothing. And if you ask the scientists, as I have done, how do you explain the idea of the Big Bang, that something came to exist from nothing? They will say this is a singularity, which is a fancy word for saying it was a one-off event which has never happened before, never happened again, and we can't explain it. We haven't the faintest idea how such a thing happened. A singularity. In other words, it's against all our rules. But in science, science begins after the Big Bang. So according to the theory of the Big Bang, what came into existence, and this is important for understanding the Ramban, incidentally, because the Ramban looks very interesting in light of modern science. The scientists say what came into existence in the Big Bang was a whole chunk, what they call a whole soup, right? They only use the word soup because they never saw a cholent. If they saw a cholent, they'd use the word cholent. But what came into existence was a whole cholent of what they call subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, and various other quarks and things, which were simply, which had not connected with each other yet. And then somehow the electrons, neutrons, and protons came together to form atoms. Somehow the atoms came together to form molecules. Somehow the molecules created elements, and somehow elements created matter, and matter created life forms. And all this was a random evolutionary event. But it started off with the creation ex nihilo, the creation yesh me'ayin of a soup of subatomic particles. It sounds incredible. If you don't believe me, please Google Origins of the Universe, read some of the material on it. It is actually very fascinating. But what for me is interesting is that the Torah 3,500 years ago said there was a beginning to creation, Bereishit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz, and for thousands of years until about less than 100 years ago, until 70 years ago, right? The whole intelligent world believed that matter had always existed and there was no beginning to it. And now suddenly they turn and say, no, we were all wrong all along. We have a new theory, the Big Bang, and the whole of the scientific world came on board, and they all agree that actually the world definitely had a beginning. And it started with a big blinding flash of pure energy, which basically corresponds to Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or Vayhi Or. The first moment was a moment of pure light, pure energy, and that started the universe being formed. According to science, it forms itself according to certain principles of random selection and evolution. According to the Torah, right, this is God's plan for developing the world. Incidentally, the number of years that science talks about is not at all a problem from a Jewish point of view. It's true that the Torah speaks about 6 days of creation, but these days are not 24-hour days, that's for sure. Right? These days are 6 eras of creation. Each day could have been a year, could have been 100 years, could have been 1 billion years. Makes no difference to us how long these days were, right? The 6 days, the biggest proof, if you like, that the days mentioned in the Torah are not 24-hour days is that the solar system is only created on day 4, right? And the whole concept of a 24-hour day doesn't make sense at all before you have a solar system. The whole 24-hour day period is based, of course, on the movement of the solar system. Without a solar system, you can't have a 24-hour day. There's no way even to measure it. And therefore, the days in Bereishit chapter 1 are not... So when science says that the world existed 13 billion years, that's fine. You can have as many billion years as you like. We count our years, and I think I mentioned this when we were learning about Rosh Hashanah, right? And Rosh Hashanah, we say Hayom Haras Olam, that Rosh Hashanah is connected to the beginning of the world. And I mentioned to you that from the Torah's point of view, the 5781 years that we count begin with Adam Harishon. They don't begin with Bereishis Bara Elokim. We are counting from Adam Harishon because we are only counting a world with spiritual meaning. And spiritual meaning and purpose only came into existence with the creation of the neshama. The neshama of the human being started on the Yom HaShishi, and then the clock starts ticking. And that's 5,781 years. And before that, there could easily have been 13 billion years with as many dinosaurs and pterodactyls and whatever you like to have. That's not a contradiction to anything in Bereishit chapter 1. So let's have a look again at the Ramban in light of this, and we'll see something interesting. So the Ramban says there was only, right? Ve'ein etzleinu b'loshan hakodesh b'hotzos hayesh me'ayin. In the Hebrew language, where we want to express the idea of yesh me'ayin, we only have one word, and that is loshan bara. The word bara doesn't just mean to make something, right? It means to create something ex nihilo, from nothing. So he says, "V'ein kol hana'aseh," but na'aseh means to make something. Tachas hashemesh alamala, hova min ha'ayin hatchala rishona. Whenever we say about something which is na'aseh, we mean that the raw materials were already there, and out of the raw materials, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made, or any manufacturer made something out of raw materials. All manufacturing is based on raw materials. But he says, so what happened? So here says the Ramban, here is his pshat. Listen to this pshat on Bereishit pasuk 1. Hotzi min ha'efes ha'gamor ha'muchlot, HaKadosh Baruch Hu derived from nothingness. Ha'gamur, total, ha'gamur, efes ha'gamur, total or utter nothingness, ha'muchlat, absolute nothingness. He created on day 1, Yesod dak ma'od, some matter which was dak ma'od, very, very refined, very, very subtle. Ein bo mamash, which was not yet formed into anything specific. It was just what I call raw material. Avalahu koach mamtzi. It was something out of which other things could be brought. He brought into the world all these bits and pieces. So actually what the Ramban is describing is exactly the subatomic particles of the scientists of today, right? He brought into existence bits and pieces like a giant Lego set, right? Which could be combined to make whatever you like, right? Nothing specific had been made yet. Muchan lekabel hatzura. But it was material which could be shaped into any form you wanted. To be realized from potential to reality. In other words, it was really what HaKadosh Baruch Hu created on day 1 was certain type of raw material which was pure potential. It was pure potential. In the modern world, we have something a little bit similar, which is interesting in genetics. Some of you might have heard of the idea of stem cells. Stem cells are cells in the human body which haven't yet been switched on. What does that mean? That means they are cells which could become anything. They could become skin, they could become muscle, they could become brain, they could become anything, right? They haven't yet been instructed by the DNA what they should become, right? They're stem cells. They can be made into anything. They are pure potential. As stem cells, they're not doing anything at all. They're just waiting for instructions. What do you want me to become? You want me to become part of the muscle, part of the intestine, part of the brain? These are potential cells, which in modern genetics and modern medicine uses very, very powerfully for certain medications. Al Kol Ponim, that's what the Ramban here is saying, that actually the whole world was what was created on day one, what was created pre-day one. So pre-day one, all that was created was pure potential, was a massive chunk, a soup, a cholent of stem cells, which could become anything, right? And then the rest of the 6 days of creation was HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructing this chunk of pure potential. This should become a tree, this should become an animal, this should become the solar system, this should become the galaxies, this should be water. All these things came into being not from zero. The moment of from zero, from nothing to something, says the Ramban, that was Pasuk 1. And that is the greatness of Pasuk 1, that it's describing this. He says, "V'hu achomer harishon hanikro layevonim hiyuli." Interesting. He's citing Greek philosophers. The Yevanim he's citing here are the writings of Aristotle and Plato that the Ramban was very familiar with, right? Because he argues with them quite frequently. But here he says they refer to something called hiyuli, right? A Greek word, which simply means matter without form. That's what it means in Greek. It means formless, right? Chomer beli tzura, matter without form, and that was the chomer tziri. And then he says, Va'acha ha'hiyuli lo boro dova. After he created out of nothing this original material, he didn't anymore do any creation ex nihilo. Nothing else was created out of nothing. Aval, what did he do? Yatzar, he fashioned it, v'osa, and he made it. Kimimeno himtzi hakol v'hilbish hatzuras v'tikkun. Okay, so basically, if you read my English translation here, incidentally, my English translations on the screen in these shurim are not literal word-by-word translations. They're basically summaries of what's been said here. There was only one moment of creation when something emerged. At this point, all the raw materials brought into existence, out of which all future creations of the universe were made. And then he goes on to say something else. And we're still in the first pasuk. V'da, he says. V'da is a bit of a stylistic word, which means, and it's important to know, he says, Ki hashamayim v'chol asher bohem chomer echad. There was one type of raw material called shamayim, and another type of raw material which was called oretz. So if you go back to the original pasuk, in the beginning, God creates two different types of pure potential soup of particles. One is called Esa Shamayim, one is heavenly, one is oretz, and one is physical. Right? I think everybody's aware of the fact, incidentally, of course, you should be aware of the fact that the word shamayim, right? Everyone should be aware of the fact that the word shamayim, which means the heavens, is, of course, in Hebrew, has got a very important double meaning to it, ambiguity. Shamayim, we often speak about shamayim meaning simply the sky, right? Or space, it's called shamayim. But clearly in the Torah, when it speaks about shamayim, it doesn't mean that. It means the spiritual world. When we speak about yirat shamayim, it doesn't mean you have fear of the sky or of the space. It means HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It means spirituality. So shamayim is a reference here, says the Ramban, in Bereishit chapter 1, verse 1. God creates spiritual raw material and physical raw material. What does it mean, spiritual raw material? So he spells it out. I've just given you one or two lines out of the Ramban. HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates a world in which there are spiritual entities. There are, for example, the neshama of the human being. The neshamas of the human being are made up of is a spiritual force, right? There's also Olam Haba is a spiritual force. There are malachim, which are spiritual forces. All these things were created, right, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu bringing into existence on day one, right, pre-day one, he brought into existence all the potential out of which everything else would be afterwards made, right? And in fact, Rashi says on day one, Rashi says about that light, the light of day one. I think we've spoken about it once before. The light of day one is actually Olam Haba. That's how Rashi learns the pasuk. Because Rashi says the real light that we are familiar with was only created on day 4. On day 4, we get the sun and the moon and all radiant bodies in the universe, right? Right? Hameir la'oretz v'ladarim oleho barachamim is yotzer ha'ma'oros. What are the ma'oros? The sun and the moon. So the sun and the moon give us the light of physics, the light that we are all familiar with, the light that shines every day, the light that is created by any luminous body. But the light of day one, says Rashi, that was Olam Haba, right? The idea that there is an eternal world, an eternal existing world to which the human neshama has a special connection, right? And the human neshama comes from there and goes back to there after it leaves this world. Right? Right? There is the journey that the neshama makes, but the neshama had to be created. So says the Rambam, the neshama and Olam Haba and all the spiritual creations, that came from the Shomayim raw material. That's what he says here. Shamayim and Eretz here, I'm just reading my own synopsis here. Shamayim and Eretz here are referred to 2 types of raw materials brought into existence. One was material and one was spiritual. And that is what happened on the... So here we have suddenly... So just to summarize for a minute, I've given you 3 different, if you like, interpretations of Pasuk 1. One of them is, I mentioned the mystical translation, that in the beginning God created the Aleph base, Es Hashamayim, and with those were the tools with which he made the world. And then I gave you the Ramban. The Ramban says, Es Hashamayim Ves Haaretz, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates this hiyuli, pure potential matter, which was then afterwards shaped into spiritual and physical entities. And then you have to add on, you have to see it all in the light of modern science. And they speak about subatomic particles coming together to create atoms and molecules and elements. And all this comes into being from the very beginning, from the moment of bara of Yesh Me'ayim. So we are actually living in a scientific world, even though the scientific world is an atheistic world in essence. That's not to say there aren't some God-fearing scientists, but science as a discipline is essentially an atheistic discipline, unfortunately, nowadays, and it's taught in an atheistic way. So much so that if somebody gets up in a science class and starts speaking about creation, he's considered to be a nutcase. He's considered to be somebody who is completely non-scientific and is in violation of all scientific principles, as if science has ever proven its cosmological theories, which of course it hasn't, because you couldn't prove it at all. But they've got theories about the origins of the universe, and those theories are the principles of faith of secular science, which are not allowed to question. So we've got our faith and they've got their faith. But in actual fact, the most important difference between the two of us really is not in how the physical world came into existence. The most important difference is the creation of the human being. So I'd like to have a look at this next pasuk. Everybody with me? So this is another famous pasuk in Bereishit chapter 1. Vayomer Elokim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, And after the whole of the universe has been created already, everything has been made, right? Everything has been already put together. It says, "Vayom Elokim na'aseh odom." Let us make man. Now, this is a very interesting statement. Let us make man. Why is this suddenly HaKadosh Baruch Hu speak in the plural? What does he mean, us? Who is us? Right? In the whole of chapter 1, at no point on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at no point does he refer to himself in the plural. It's Vayom Elokim Yehi Rokia, Vayom Elokim Tadsha or Tesha. God speaks alone as the creator. Suddenly here he's speaking in the plural, right? And he's creating man b'tzalmeinu kidmuseinu. I'd like to actually devote a whole shir to understanding what the concept of Tselem Elokim means. There's no question that in Bereishit chapter 1, the most world-changing idea that we have is the idea of the Tselem Elokim, that a human being is qualitatively not part of the animal world. He has similarities to the animal world, but he is a Tselem Elokim, which however we understand it, it means that within the human being, there is something of eternal value, which is not the case with the animals, with the planets, with the plants, with any other part of creation. Nothing else has a spiritual innate value to it, except for the human being. And that's the Tselem Elokim. And this whole idea of the sanctity of life, the tremendous value that we place on the preservation of life, and chas v'shalom, the opposite, the taking of human life, is all based on Tselem Elokim. And when you're listening to this week's Parsha, incidentally, if you go to shul, you'll hear it being lamed, and if you don't go to shul, you should read it yourself, right? So when Noach makes his covenant with God after the flood is over, so Noach is allowed, God gives him permission to use the animal world and even eat the animals, right? The animals now become completely subject to human life. But then the pasuk says that, but shofech dam ha'odom ba'odom domo yishafech. Anybody who kills another person, right, is chayiv misa. He is committing a capital offense. Why? So how does that pasuk continue? Ki b'tselem elokim osos ha'odom. Because man is created b'tselem elokim, that's why murder is such a terrible sin. Because you're not destroying an animal. You're destroying something of eternal spiritual value. And the care for the human being and the covenant we give to human beings and the way in which we relate as human beings, which we take for granted, is all based on this idea that God has endowed us with a Tselem Elokim, with a spiritual force and a spiritual purpose and a spiritual meaning. But what's interesting here for our purposes today in today's shir is the use of this na'aseh. Why does he use the word and we should? So let's go back again to the Ramban. Oma ba'odom na'aseh. Uniquely in the creation of the world, it's the plural form. Like I've said, right? Let us make man. What is the us? So he says kaloma, meaning to say, ani. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, ani v'ha'aretz. I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the source of all the spiritual power in the world, together with the oretz, with the physical matter that I created, meaning Bereishit bara Elokim, together we are going to create this being, right? So he says here, the plural form, let us make man, is used here to indicate that for the first time, a creature will be made combining both the divine element of the soul and the physical element of the human body. The naaseh is kaviyachol, as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is talking to the physical world. And I say, look, I've made all this physical, if you like, plasma, or this physical raw material, right? I'm now saying until now, everything has been made out of physical subatomic particles, out of physical raw material, or it's been made out of purely spiritual material. Now, for the first time, na'aseh, we're going to make one hybrid creation. Right? Some people think hybrid is just the name of a car. I'm afraid it isn't. Hybrid means you're bringing two different systems to work together with each other. And what are these two different systems? Is the neshama and the guf. The soul and the human body work together in such a way the soul gives life to the human body, and the human body gives a format to the soul that it can exist in this world. And that is the na'aseh, right? The na'aseh of the of this pasuk, right? And that is and that's why it's only mentioned here with the creation of man, because man is the only creature which combines within the man and the woman, has got within themselves both the physical and the spiritual entities. And that's why it's always such a pity to zip through Parshas Bereishit so quickly. Before you wake up after Rosh Hashanah and Kippur Sukkot, it's already Parshas Noach, and no one's really given much thought to Parshas Bereishit. I remember discussing this with my dear friend who's no longer alive, Rabbi Isaac Bernstein. Some of you here knew Rabbi Isaac Bernstein, and some of you even were participants of the shiurim he gave in our shul at Ner Yisrael for so many years. He gave the most remarkable and wonderful shiurim in his inimitable Irish baritone musical voice, right? The way he dramatically described all his divrei Torah. And he often said to me, I'd like to spend a whole year of shiurim just on Parshas Bereishit, right? That was part of his plan. We had plans for years and years. Sadly, he had a heart attack in his early 50s and passed away very sadly about 25 years ago. And it was a great blow to the whole community. And his shiur was actually a very important element in the whole growth of Ner Yisrael, the whole growth of our community. And he was indeed a truly remarkable Talmud Chacham and a good friend of mine. But his way of presenting divrei Torah was quite unique and dramatic and beautiful. But the idea of spending many, many weeks just looking at Parshas Bereishit is because within Parshas Bereishit are contained lots of the fundamental elements of our perspective on life. By saying, A, that God created the world, meaning it has a purpose, and B, that the human being is a Tzelem Elokim, we've already laid the foundations for a completely different way of life. When I say different from the whole secular atheistic world that surrounds us. People who live a secular atheistic world don't believe that the world has a purpose and that God created it, and they don't believe that the human being has a neshama of eternal value, right? Were they to believe that, were they to understand that fully, you couldn't live an atheistic, secular life as we see today in the Western world. So really, Parshas Bereishit gives us the Yesodot HaEmunah. The foundations of our emunah lie in our understanding of how the world came to exist and what are the elements that were introduced into this world. I'd like to just quickly have a look at one other short thing, which is relevant to what I'm saying now, and that is an interesting phenomenon. I've entitled this Ki Tov and then Tov Ma'od. So I just want to basically show you how on day one it says Vayar Elokim as Ha'or Ki Tov. On day one it says God created the light and it was Tov. On day two it is not mentioned. That's a whole different story. On day three it also says Ki Tov. He saw that the water and the earth that was Tov, and then on day three he also created the world of the plants. And the trees and the plants. And again, here he says Ki Tov, right? the plant. On day 4 again, he creates the solar system, and he says about it, Ki Tov. On day 5, he creates the animal world, and he says Ki Tov. On day 6, he creates more animals, and he says Ki Tov. And then he creates the human being, and then in the end, he doesn't say Ki Tov. He says Vehine Tov Ma'od. And this is a very interesting theme in the whole of understanding of chapter 1, how every stage along the way was Ki Tov, and in the end, it was Tov Ma'od. In the end, this was a Tov Ma'od. So the Ramban actually has got a very strange commentary on this, but it's based on the Medrash. So he says, V'hosif biyom zeh leimor. At the very end of the 6th day, the Pasuk adds, Bavur she'yadaber b'chalal, because it speaks now about the sum total of the universe, the yimtza ra biktzasa. In the universe, when God created the solar system, it was tov, meaning it was pure, it worked exactly as it was created to, and it didn't have anything negative or destructive in it. There was nothing negative or destructive in any of the natural forces. But once the human beings had been created, and the world had been created in whole, there was ra b'miktzasa. There was a little bit of destructiveness, right, in the world. V'amar ki tov ma'od. What does it mean, tov ma'od? So he says ma'odo tov. So he understands it to mean the opposite of what you and I would have thought it means. We would have thought ki tov means it's good, tov ma'od means it's very good. But he says, no, ma'od can also mean the opposite. Ma'od can mean most of it is good, but some of it isn't. Some of it is destructive. Right? The word ma'od can have that nuance to it. So he says, he brings the Medrash Rabbah, which says, Tov ma'od v'nei tov zeh yetzer hara. So here's an interesting thing, that once the human beings had been created, there existed in the world a yetzer hara. The yetzer hara is the dark side of human nature. Human nature has a positive side to it, of morality and love and generosity and giving and intellect and understanding and emunah. That's the light. But the human nature also has a dark side to it, right? Of greed and anger and jealousy, right? And ego. All that's the dark side of human nature. That's the yetzer hara. Once the human being had created it in the world, there was also the power of the yetzer hara. It was no longer completely tov. It was mainly good, right? Why was the yetzer hara created? In order that the human being should use his bechira, his choice to overcome it, right? And to grapple with it and to decide to lead a good life and to overcome one's ego, one's greed, and one's improper desires and all these things. That's all part of the yetzer hara. So says the Ramban, once the human being had been created, you couldn't say about the whole universe anymore, ki tov. You can't say that anymore. You can only say that tov ma'od, it's mainly good, but it has in it also this element of negativity. I see we're coming to the end of the time of the Shia, so I'll just add in Baal Peh. I'll just tell you something very beautiful that is written here by the Sforno. So the Sforno is writing in the 15th century, but the Sforno, in addition to being one of the great Jewish leaders of Italy and a great Talmud Chacham, was also a scientist. But he says something which only really modern science has come to understand completely. He says each system that was created, the system of the plants, the system of the fish and the sea and the oceans and the solar system and everything, each one in and of itself was magnificent, was a magnificent creation. But at the very end of creation, it wasn't just tov, it was tov ma'od. What does tov ma'od mean? Tov ma'od means that the sum is greater, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, what does that mean? It means you can have a dozen different brilliant systems, but when you put them all into one integrated system, and each one works with each other, what we call today synergy. What does synergy mean? Synergy means that each power enhances the other power, right? You can have what we call today teamwork, right? You're going to have 11 fantastic football players. Each one is a genius. But if you've got a good manager and a good coach, you can get them to work together in such a way as a team that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole means that each one of them is working with each other, and they're all enhancing each other. And that is part of the most, says the Sforno, that's what it means, tov ma'od. What we call today ecology. Ecology is the study of how the oceans affect the atmosphere and how the atmosphere affects the weather, and the weather affects the mountains affect the lakes, and everything affects everything else. And everything is one integrated system. That was Tov Ma'od. I remember as a teenager, when I studied science, and I was being quite excited and looking into the fact that, of course, we all know that human beings need oxygen. We can't live for very long without oxygen. Oxygen we need when we're awake or asleep. We need oxygen, but there's a finite amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, right? But we give out carbon dioxide. But guess what? The trees absorb carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. They use photosynthesis to combine the sun and the water, and somehow they absorb the carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. So here you have human beings breathing in oxygen and out carbon dioxide, and you have trees breathing in carbon dioxide and out oxygen, and we need each other. That, says the Sforno, is Tov Ma'od. And that's just one microscopic, minuscule example of the ecology, of the way different systems in the world, apparently it needs 7 or 8 trees to produce enough oxygen for each human being. But who knew? Who knew that trees and human beings were linked with each other in such a way that we needed each other so desperately that we couldn't exist without each other? That, he says, is the Tov Ma'od of Pasuk. The final Pasuk of chapter 1 says, now that the entire universe has been created, HaKadosh Baruch Hu pressed the last button. And the last button was how each of these systems worked with all the other systems together in every single detail. How the gravity and now they're talking about how the black holes in space have got a certain magnetic field, which is very important to hold the whole solar system in its place. Right? We used to think that galaxies and deep space had nothing to do with our solar system. It turns out that the whole, not just the solar system, but the whole universe has got forces which hold each other in place, and that was the Tov Ma'od. Okay, I've touched on a few elements in creation, the building blocks of creation, the final purpose of creation. Maybe next time we will have a closer look at the Tselem Elokim element, how it's learnt by various different sources, and what the implications are at a deeper level. It's wonderful to see you. You can unmute everybody, Ellie, if you like.
And he gets muted.
He's muted him.
Rabbi Kimche.
Hear you. Brilliant, Shio. Thank you. Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can't hear you, but
Can you,
We couldn't unmute, but thank you.
Rabbi Kimche,
thank you.
Can't hear you.
can you,
Ask a question.
I can't seem to be able to unmute Rabbi Kimche for some reason.
can you,
It's been a wonderful share anyway. Rabbi
Kimche, you brought back beautiful memories for me.
Now unmuted. Thank you, Shep.
Rabbi Kimche, you brought back beautiful memories of Rabbi Bernstein by mentioning him.
Yes,
I worked with him for 4 years,
really.
and I still could remember when you said that he thought so much of Bereishit, his Simchas Torah shir,
Yeah.
where he brought a very comical, hilarious shir for about 45 minutes on Bereishit, Malachim, and the
Yeah.
Malachim being responsible for the recipe for cholent.
Yes.
He was
Yeah,
a
he had-
remarkable human being, and we
Yeah,
lived in the
most
same
remarkable-
building.
You're quite right.
And-
His humor was also really
Very
powerful.
humorous.
Yes, absolutely. What were you saying, Shirley? You said something. Yes, it's nice to see you.
Well, I wanted to ask a question. I don't remember which parish it was. I actually dropped at the end, and maybe you said this, but that one of the explanations of Naaseh Adam, the Tzalmenu, is Hashem took, man became, he had aspects of every single animal, creature,